Hello and welcome. Today, I will whisper to you about one of the most fascinating and legendary events in medieval history, the Third Crusade. So, get comfortable, relax, and let's dive into this incredible story together. The Third Crusade, often called the King's Crusade, was one of the most famous and dramatic of all the crusading campaigns. It took place between 1189 and 1192 and was launched in response to the shocking fall of Jerusalem to the Muslim leader Saladin in 1187. The capture of this holy city, which had been under Christian control since the First Crusade nearly a century earlier, sent shockwaves throughout the Christian world. The news of Jerusalem's fall deeply troubled the papacy, the nobility, and the people of Europe, prompting calls for a new crusade to reclaim the sacred city and restore Christian dominance in the Holy Land. The Third Crusade was marked by the involvement of some of the most powerful and iconic figures of the medieval period. Three of Europe's most prominent kings, Richard I of England, known as Richard the Lionheart, Philip II of France, and Frederick I Barbarossa, the Holy Roman Emperor, answered the call to lead their armies to the east. These rulers, each with their own ambitions and challenges, embarked on a journey that would take them across seas and deserts, through battles and negotiations, in a bid to reclaim Jerusalem and assert their power on the world stage. Unlike the earlier crusades, the Third Crusade was characterized by a mix of extraordinary military campaigns and intricate diplomacy. The Crusaders would encounter not only the formidable military might of Saladin, but also the complexities of navigating alliances, rivalries, and the shifting political landscape of the Near East. The interactions between Richard the Lionheart and Saladin, in particular, would become the stuff of legend, two great leaders pitted against each other in a contest of both arms and wits. The Third Crusade also highlighted the growing tensions and divisions within Christendom itself. The rivalry between Richard and Philip, as well as the internal conflicts within the crusading armies, would play a significant role in the unfolding drama. These challenges would ultimately shape the course and outcome of the crusade, influencing the future of the Crusader states and the relationship between East and West. As we embark on this journey into the Third Crusade, we will explore the motivations, strategies, and key events that define this historic campaign. We will delve into the lives and legacies of the kings and warriors who fought for control of the Holy Land, and we will witness the battles, sieges, and negotiations that determined the fate of Jerusalem and the wider region. So, join me as we unravel the story of the Third Crusade, a tale of heroism, rivalry, and faith, set against the backdrop of one of the most turbulent and transformative periods in medieval history. The period leading up to the Third Crusade was marked by a complex web of political, military, and religious dynamics that set the stage for one of the most significant and well-known campaigns in medieval history. To fully understand the motivations and circumstances that led to the launch of the Third Crusade, we must delve into the state of the Crusader states, the rise of Saladin, and the broader geopolitical landscape of the late 12th century. The state of the Crusader states. By the mid-12th century, the Crusader states, principally the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the County of Tripoli, the Principality of Antioch, and the County of Edessa, were well established, but their security was increasingly precarious. These Christian enclaves in the Levant had been created in the wake of the First Crusade and had become a crucial foothold for Western Christendom in the East. However, over time, they found themselves surrounded by increasingly powerful Muslim forces and beset by internal divisions. The Kingdom of Jerusalem, the most prominent of the Crusader states, had enjoyed periods of relative stability and prosperity. However, it was also plagued by political infighting and a lack of strong leadership, especially following the death of King Baldwin IV, known as the Leper King. Baldwin's death in 1185 left the kingdom in a vulnerable position, as his successor, Baldwin V, was a child who soon died, leading to a succession crisis. The eventual coronation of Guy of Lusignan, a relatively weak and unpopular ruler, only exacerbated the kingdom's internal discord. The Crusader states' vulnerability was further heightened by their reliance on reinforcements and resources from Europe. Over the decades, the enthusiasm for crusading had waned, and the flow of knights and soldiers from Europe had slowed significantly. The local nobility, while experienced in defending their territories, struggled to maintain a unified front against the external threats they faced. The rise of Saladin. During this period of Christian weakness, the Muslim world found a unifying and formidable leader in Saladin. Born Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub in 1137, Saladin rose to prominence as a military leader and statesman, eventually becoming the Sultan of Egypt and Syria. His rise marked the beginning of a new era of Muslim resistance against the Crusader states. Saladin was not only a skilled military commander, but also a shrewd politician and diplomat. He successfully united the fragmented Muslim territories under his leadership, forging alliances that extended from Egypt to Mesopotamia. His ability to consolidate power and present a united front against the Crusaders was a significant factor in his success. One of Saladin's primary goals was to reclaim Jerusalem, which he viewed as a sacred duty. In 1187, after years of careful planning and military campaigns, Saladin achieved this goal by defeating the Crusader forces at the Battle of Hattin, a decisive engagement that effectively shattered the Christian military presence in the region. The battle was a catastrophic loss for the Crusaders, with many of their leaders captured or killed, and it led directly to the fall of Jerusalem later that year. The fall of Jerusalem. The loss of Jerusalem to Saladin in October 1187 was a devastating blow to Christendom. The city had been in Christian hands since its capture during the First Crusade in 1099 and was the most important religious and symbolic center for the Crusaders. The fall of Jerusalem sent shockwaves throughout Europe, prompting urgent calls for a new crusade to reclaim the Holy City. Pope Urban III, upon hearing of the loss, reportedly died of shock, and his successor, Pope Gregory VIII, immediately began to rally Christendom for a renewed effort to retake Jerusalem. In October 1187, Gregory issued the papal bull Audita Tremendi, which called for a new crusade. This call to arms was echoed by the clergy across Europe, who preached the need to avenge the loss of Jerusalem and restore Christian control over the Holy Land. The political landscape in Europe. The political situation in Europe also played a crucial role in shaping the Third Crusade. By the late 12th century, Europe was dominated by powerful monarchs who wielded significant influence. Among these were Richard I of England, Philip II of France, and Frederick I Barbarossa, the Holy Roman Emperor. Each of these rulers had their own reasons for joining the crusade, ranging from religious devotion to political and territorial ambitions. Richard the Lionheart, who would become one of the most famous figures of the Third Crusade, was deeply committed to the cause. His predecessors had been involved in the Crusader movement, and Richard saw the recapture of Jerusalem as a way to fulfill his own chivalric and religious ideals. Moreover, the crusade offered him an opportunity to assert his authority and military prowess on an international stage. Philip II of France, though initially hesitant, recognized the political benefits of joining the crusade. By participating, he could strengthen his influence in European politics and assert his leadership over the French nobility, many of whom were eager to join the campaign. Frederick Barbarossa, the seasoned and powerful Holy Roman Emperor, also took up the cross, motivated by a combination of piety, a desire to restore the glory of the Holy Roman Empire, and the opportunity to resolve internal conflicts by directing the energies of his nobles toward the crusade. Preparing for the crusade. In the years leading up to the Third Crusade, Europe saw a renewed wave of religious fervor and preparation. Nobles and knights across the continent took the cross, pledging to join the crusade and reclaim Jerusalem. Vast sums of money were raised, and armies were assembled, with leaders like Richard, Philip, and Frederick preparing to lead their forces on the long and perilous journey to the Holy Land. The Third Crusade was thus born out of a combination of desperation, religious devotion, and political ambition. It was a response to the loss of Jerusalem, a city that held immense religious significance for Christians, and it represented a last-ditch effort to preserve the Crusader states and the Christian presence in the Holy Land. As the crusading armies prepared to depart, the world watched with bated breath, knowing that the outcome of this campaign would shape the future of the medieval world. Key figures before the Third Crusade. Richard I of England, Richard the Lionheart. Before the Third Crusade, Richard I, also known as Richard the Lionheart, was already one of the most powerful and prominent rulers in Europe. Born in 1157 as the third son of King Henry II of England and Eleanor of Aquitaine, Richard was raised in the culturally rich and politically complex court of Aquitaine, where he developed a strong sense of chivalry and military prowess. Richard was well versed in warfare from a young age, having participated in rebellions against his father alongside his brothers. By the time he ascended to the English throne in 1189, Richard had already proven himself as a capable military leader. His reputation for bravery and tactical skill earned him the moniker the Lionheart. His ascension to the throne coincided with the call for the Third Crusade, and Richard's commitment to the cause was immediate and enthusiastic. Richard's motivations for joining the crusade were multifaceted. He was deeply religious and saw the recovery of Jerusalem as a sacred duty. Additionally, participating in the crusade presented an opportunity for Richard to assert his authority and military leadership on an international stage, while also potentially securing valuable territories and influence in the East. Before departing for the Holy Land, Richard took significant steps to secure his kingdom, including making provisions for the governance of England in his absence and raising substantial funds to finance his campaign. Saladin, Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub. Saladin, born in 1137 in Tikrit, Iraq, had risen to prominence well before the Third Crusade as a unifying force in the Muslim world. By the late 12th century, Saladin had already established himself as a formidable military leader and statesman. After serving under his uncle Shirkuh in Egypt, Saladin became the vizier of Egypt and eventually the Sultan, founding the Ayyubid dynasty. Saladin's rise to power was marked by his ability to consolidate Muslim territories, uniting Egypt, Syria, and parts of Mesopotamia under his leadership. His strategic acumen and diplomatic skill allowed him to forge alliances and create a strong, centralized state capable of resisting the Crusader states. Saladin's primary goal before the Third Crusade was to reclaim Jerusalem, a city of immense religious significance to Muslims, which had been under Christian control since the First Crusade. In 1187, Saladin achieved a decisive victory at the Battle of Hattin, where he annihilated the Crusader forces and captured many key leaders. This victory paved the way for the recapture of Jerusalem, an event that shocked the Christian world and directly led to the launch of the Third Crusade. By the time the Third Crusade was called, Saladin was at the height of his power, controlling vast territories and commanding a highly effective military force. His reputation as a just and chivalrous leader made him a respected figure even among his enemies. Frederick I Barbarossa, Holy Roman Emperor. Frederick I Barbarossa, born in 1122, was the Holy Roman Emperor and one of the most powerful rulers in Europe before the Third Crusade. Frederick had a long and distinguished career as emperor, during which he worked to consolidate the power of the Holy Roman Empire and restore its influence across Europe. He was known for his military campaigns in Italy and his efforts to assert imperial authority over the papacy and the German princes. Before the Third Crusade, Frederick was a seasoned warrior with a deep sense of duty to Christendom. He had participated in earlier crusades and saw the call to reclaim Jerusalem as both a religious obligation and an opportunity to reinforce the prestige of the Holy Roman Empire. His decision to join the Third Crusade in 1189 was met with great enthusiasm, as Frederick commanded one of the largest and most experienced armies in Europe. Frederick's preparations for the crusade were meticulous. He negotiated safe passage through Byzantine territory and ensured that his army was well provisioned for the long journey. However, Frederick's involvement in the Third Crusade was tragically cut short when he drowned while crossing the Salif River in 1190. His death caused a significant portion of his army to disband and return home, weakening the overall strength of the Crusader forces. Philip II of France. Philip II, known as Philip Augustus, was the king of France before the Third Crusade. Born in 1165, Philip ascended to the throne in 1180 and quickly established himself as a shrewd and capable monarch. His reign was marked by efforts to strengthen the French monarchy, consolidate royal authority, and expand the kingdom's territories at the expense of the Angevin Empire controlled by the Plantagenets, Richard's family. Philip's decision to join the Third Crusade was driven by a combination of religious duty and political calculation. He recognized that participating in the crusade would enhance his prestige and position him as a leader of Christendom. However, his relationship with Richard the Lionheart was complex and often adversarial, particularly due to their rivalry over territories in France. Before embarking on the crusade, Philip worked to secure his kingdom, ensuring that it would be well governed in his absence. He also raised funds and gathered an army to join the campaign. Unlike Richard, who was motivated by a deep personal commitment to the crusading cause, Philip's primary focus was on maintaining his influence in Europe and ensuring that his interests were protected while he was away. Before the Third Crusade, the political landscape of the Eastern Mediterranean and the Levant was incredibly complex, with various powers vying for control and influence in the region. Understanding the geopolitical context of this period is crucial for grasping the motivations and challenges faced by the Crusaders as they embarked on their campaign. The Crusader States. The Crusader States, principally the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the County of Tripoli, the Principality of Antioch, and the County of Edessa, were established following the First Crusade and represented the Christian foothold in the Levant. However, by the late 12th century, these states were in a precarious position. The Kingdom of Jerusalem, the most prominent of these states, was facing internal strife and external threats. The kingdom had once enjoyed periods of relative stability, but by the 1180s, it was struggling due to weak leadership and internal divisions. The death of King Baldwin IV, known as the Leper King, in 1185, followed by the early death of his successor Baldwin V, left the kingdom in a state of political turmoil. The ascension of Guy of Lusignan to the throne further exacerbated tensions, as he was an unpopular and relatively ineffective ruler. The kingdom was also suffering from a lack of manpower and resources, as enthusiasm for crusading had waned in Europe and fewer reinforcements were arriving to bolster its defenses. The Principality of Antioch and the County of Tripoli were similarly vulnerable. Antioch, located in the northern Levant, was strategically important but constantly under threat from Muslim forces and the Byzantine Empire, which sought to assert control over the region. The principality's rulers struggled to maintain a strong defense, often relying on precarious alliances with neighboring states. Tripoli, to the south of Antioch, faced its own challenges, including limited resources and isolation from the other Crusader states. The fall of the county of Edessa in 1144 to the Seljuk Turks had already dealt a significant blow to the Crusader states, leading to the failed Second Crusade and highlighting the vulnerability of these Christian enclaves. The Muslim world. On the Muslim side, the late 12th century saw the rise of a powerful and unifying figure, Saladin. Born Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub in 1137, Saladin emerged as the leader who could unite the fragmented Muslim states against the Crusaders. By the time of the Third Crusade, Saladin had established himself as Sultan of Egypt and Syria and had successfully united much of the Muslim world under his leadership. Saladin's unification of Egypt, Syria, and parts of Mesopotamia was a significant achievement, creating a strong and centralized Muslim state capable of challenging the Crusader states. His military campaigns were marked by a combination of strategic brilliance and diplomatic skill, allowing him to expand his control and weaken the Crusader presence in the region. The capture of Jerusalem in 1187, following the decisive Battle of Hattin, was the pinnacle of Saladin's efforts and a major turning point in the struggle between the Muslim and Christian worlds. The fall of Jerusalem sent shockwaves through Christendom and underscored the growing strength of Saladin's forces. His ability to unite the Muslim world against the Crusaders was a key factor in the launch of the Third Crusade, as European leaders recognized the need to respond to this existential threat. The Byzantine Empire. The Byzantine Empire, which had once been the dominant power in the Eastern Mediterranean, played a complex and often ambivalent role in the lead-up to the Third Crusade. The Byzantines had a long history of conflict with the Seljuk Turks and other Muslim powers, but were also wary of the Crusader states, which they saw as potential rivals for control of the region. By the late 12th century, the Byzantine Empire was under the rule of Emperor Isaac II Angelos, who came to power in 1185. Isaac's reign was marked by internal strife and external pressures, including the threat posed by the Normans and other European powers. The relationship between the Byzantine Empire and the Crusader states was tense, as the Byzantines were concerned about the growing influence of the Western European powers in the Levant. The Byzantines, while not directly involved in the Third Crusade, were crucial in shaping the geopolitical landscape of the region. The empire's control over key territories in Asia Minor and its strategic position between Europe and the Levant made it an important player in the broader conflict. The Byzantines often sought to balance their relations with both the Crusaders and the Muslim powers, aiming to protect their own interests in a volatile and shifting political environment. The broader geopolitical landscape. The broader geopolitical landscape before the Third Crusade was characterized by a delicate balance of power between various Christian and Muslim states, each with its own ambitions and challenges. In Europe, the call for the Third Crusade was met with varying levels of enthusiasm, influenced by the internal politics of different kingdoms. The rivalry between Richard I of England and Philip II of France, for example, would later play a significant role in the conduct of the Crusade. In the Muslim world, the unification under Saladin was both a response to the threat posed by the Crusader states and a reflection of the growing strength of Islamic leadership in the region. Saladin's ability to rally Muslim forces and his success in recapturing Jerusalem highlighted the shifting balance of power in the eastern Mediterranean. The political situation in the Levant was one of precarious equilibrium, with both Christian and Muslim states jockeying for position in a region that had become the focal point of a centuries-long struggle for control of the Holy Land. The stage was set for the Third Crusade, which would be shaped by the ambitions, rivalries, and strategic calculations of these key players. Before the Third Crusade, the social and economic conditions in the Levant and surrounding regions were shaped by the complex interplay of various cultural, religious, and political factors. These areas were home to a diverse population, including Christians, Muslims, Jews, and other ethnic and religious groups, each of which experienced the social and economic dynamics of the time differently. Understanding these conditions provides important context for the events leading up to the Third Crusade. The Crusader states. Social conditions. The Crusader states, particularly the Kingdom of Jerusalem, were characterized by a highly stratified society. The ruling elite was primarily composed of European nobles who had settled in the Levant following the First Crusade. These nobles, along with their retainers, formed the upper class, holding significant power and wealth. They lived in fortified cities and castles, from where they administered their territories and collected taxes from the local population. The local population in the Crusader states was a mix of native Christians, mostly Eastern Orthodox and Syrian Christians, Muslims, and Jews. These groups were generally allowed to continue practicing their religions, but they were subject to the rule of the Frankish, Western European nobility. The native Christians often served as intermediaries between the ruling Franks and the local Muslim population, holding administrative and bureaucratic roles. Social tensions were common in the Crusader states, particularly between the Frankish rulers and the local populations. The Franks often viewed themselves as superior to the local inhabitants, which led to a degree of social segregation. However, over time, some degree of cultural exchange occurred, with the Franks adopting certain aspects of local customs, dress, and language. Intermarriage between Franks and local Christians also occurred, although it was less common. Economic conditions. Economically, the Crusader states were heavily dependent on trade, both within the region and with Europe. The Levant was a key hub for trade routes connecting Europe, Asia, and Africa. Goods such as spices, silk, and other luxury items passed through ports like Acre and Tyre, making these cities important centers of commerce. The Crusader states benefited from this trade, collecting taxes and duties on goods passing through their territories. Agriculture was the primary economic activity in the rural areas, with crops such as wheat, barley, olives, and grapes being cultivated. However, the agricultural productivity of the Crusader states was often hindered by the constant threat of warfare and raids, which disrupted farming and trade. The Franks also relied on the local population to work the land, often imposing heavy taxes and labor obligations on them. The economy of the Crusader states was also supported by the influx of resources from Europe. Pilgrims and Crusaders brought wealth with them, and the Catholic Church collected tithes and donations to support the maintenance of the Holy Land. However, by the time of the Third Crusade, The economic situation in the Crusader states had become increasingly precarious due to the ongoing conflicts with Muslim forces and the loss of key territories. The Muslim territories. Social conditions. The social structure in the Muslim territories of the Levant and Egypt was similarly hierarchical but more fluid than in the Crusader states. The ruling elite consisted of the Ayyubid dynasty under Saladin, along with various local emirs and military commanders who governed different regions. These leaders were responsible for maintaining order, collecting taxes, and leading military campaigns. The general population was predominantly Muslim, with significant Christian and Jewish minorities. Islamic law, or Sharia, governed social relations, and non-Muslims were generally allowed to practice their religions as dhimmis, or protected people, in exchange for paying a special tax known as the jizya. This arrangement allowed for a degree of religious tolerance, although non-Muslims were subject to certain legal restrictions. Social mobility in the Muslim world was somewhat greater than in the Crusader states, particularly within the military and administrative ranks. Merit and loyalty to the ruling dynasty could lead to advancement, and it was not uncommon for individuals of humble origins to rise to positions of power and influence. The Islamic world at this time was also characterized by a rich intellectual and cultural life, with scholars, poets, and scientists contributing to a vibrant cultural milieu. Economic conditions. The Muslim territories of the Levant and Egypt were economically diverse and prosperous, benefiting from their strategic location at the crossroads of trade routes between Europe, Asia, and Africa. Major cities like Cairo, Damascus, and Aleppo were bustling centers of commerce, with markets, souks, offering goods from across the known world. These cities were also centers of manufacturing, producing textiles, metalwork, glassware, and other goods that were highly prized in both local and international markets. Agriculture played a vital role in the economy, particularly in the fertile Nile Delta and the Levantine valleys. Crops such as wheat, barley, dates, and citrus fruits were cultivated, and the region was known for its advanced irrigation techniques, which allowed for more intensive farming. The agricultural economy was supported by a system of land ownership where large estates, ikta, were managed by local lords who collected taxes and rents from the peasants working the land. The economy of the Muslim world was also bolstered by the extensive trade networks that connected the Middle East with the wider world. Caravans traveled across the deserts, bringing goods such as spices, silk, and precious metals from India, China, and Africa to the Mediterranean ports. The wealth generated by this trade helped to finance the military campaigns of leaders like Saladin and supported the construction of grand architectural projects, including mosques, palaces, and fortifications. The Byzantine Empire. Social conditions. The Byzantine Empire, though not directly involved in the Third Crusade, played a significant role in the broader geopolitical landscape of the region. By the late 12th century, Byzantine society was highly stratified, with a powerful aristocracy that controlled vast estates and wielded significant influence over the imperial court. The emperor was at the top of the social hierarchy, but his power was often challenged by rival factions within the court and by regional governors who sought greater autonomy. The general population of the Byzantine Empire was predominantly Greek Orthodox Christian, with significant minorities of Muslims, Jews, and other Christian sections. The Orthodox Church played a central role in everyday life, influencing everything from education to law and social customs. Religious festivals and rituals were important aspects of social life, and the church also played a key role in charity and social welfare. Byzantine society was marked by a high degree of urbanization, with major cities like Constantinople, Thessalonica, and Antioch serving as centers of culture, education, and commerce. The empire was also known for its rich artistic and intellectual traditions, with scholars, theologians, and artists contributing to the preservation and transmission of classical knowledge. Economic conditions. The Byzantine economy was one of the most advanced in the medieval world, benefiting from its strategic position at the crossroads of Europe and Asia. Constantinople, the capital, was a major hub for trade, connecting the Black Sea, the Aegean, and the Mediterranean. The city's markets were filled with goods from across the empire and beyond, including silk from China, spices from India, and furs from Russia. Agriculture was the backbone of the Byzantine economy, with large estates producing grain, olives, wine, and other staples. The empire's sophisticated tax system ensured that the state received a steady income from agricultural production, which was used to fund the military and other state functions. The empire also had a thriving manufacturing sector, producing textiles, weapons, and luxury goods that were exported across the Mediterranean. The Byzantine economy was relatively stable compared to the Crusader states, but it was also under pressure from external threats, including the Normans in Italy, the Seljuk Turks in Anatolia, and the ever-present danger of internal strife. The empire's wealth and strategic location made it a key player in the politics of the region, but it also made it a target for conquest and plunder. The period leading up to the Third Crusade was characterized by intense religious fervor and complex interfaith dynamics, both within the Christian and Muslim worlds. The religious beliefs, motivations, and tensions of the time played a critical role in shaping the actions of the key players and the broader geopolitical landscape of the era. Here's an overview of the religious situation and the prevailing religious thoughts in both the Christian and Muslim worlds before the Third Crusade. The Christian world. Crusading ideology. In the Christian world, the concept of the crusade was deeply rooted in religious beliefs and was seen as a sacred duty. The idea of taking the cross to defend or reclaim the Holy Land was closely tied to the doctrine of penitential warfare. Crusaders were promised spiritual rewards, including the forgiveness of sins, which were granted by the Church. This belief in the redemptive power of crusading was a powerful motivator for many Europeans, from kings and nobles to common soldiers. The loss of Jerusalem to Saladin in 1187 was perceived as a profound spiritual crisis in Christendom. The city was not only a strategic military objective, but also the most important site in Christian history, being the location of Jesus Christ's crucifixion and resurrection. The fall of Jerusalem was seen as a punishment from God for the sins of the Christian world, and reclaiming the city became an urgent religious imperative. The papacy played a central role in promoting the crusade, framing it as a righteous cause that had the potential to unite Christendom under a common goal. Pope Gregory VIII, who issued the papal bull Audita Tremendi in 1187, called on all Christians to take up arms to avenge the loss of Jerusalem and restore Christian control over the Holy Land. The Church's endorsement of the crusade was crucial in rallying support across Europe and in legitimizing the Crusaders' actions as divinely sanctioned. Religious tensions and unity. The Christian world in this period was not monolithic. It was divided along doctrinal, political, and cultural lines. The Catholic Church in Western Europe, led by the Pope in Rome, was the primary driver of the crusading movement, but it faced tensions with the Eastern Orthodox Church, which was centered in Constantinople and led by the Byzantine Emperor. These tensions were partly the result of the Great Schism of 1054, which had formally divided Christianity into Western, Catholic, and Eastern, Orthodox, branches. While the Byzantine Empire shared the Catholic desire to see Muslim power checked, particularly in the Eastern Mediterranean, relations between the two branches of Christianity were often strained. The Byzantines were wary of the Latin Crusaders, seeing them as both potential allies and potential threats to their own control over the region. Despite these internal tensions, the call for the Third Crusade temporarily brought together various Christian factions. The need to defend Christendom from what was seen as an existential threat led to a significant, if temporary, alignment of interests. However, these underlying divisions would resurface throughout the Crusade, affecting the cooperation between different Christian leaders and their armies. Pilgrimage and piety. The period before the Third Crusade also saw a rise in popular piety and the practice of pilgrimage. Jerusalem and other sites in the Holy Land were major destinations for Christian pilgrims who undertook long and often perilous journeys as acts of devotion. The idea of pilgrimage was closely connected to the concept of the Crusade, as both involved traveling to the Holy Land for religious purposes. For many Crusaders, the journey to Jerusalem was seen as a form of armed pilgrimage, combining spiritual devotion with military action. The religious atmosphere of the time was also marked by a deep sense of eschatology, or the belief in the imminent end of the world and the coming of the Last Judgment. This belief was particularly strong among the common people, who saw the Crusades as part of a larger cosmic struggle between good and evil. The reclaiming of Jerusalem was not just a political or military objective, it was seen as a necessary step in the fulfillment of divine prophecy. The Muslim world. Jihad and religious unity. In the Muslim world, the concept of jihad, or struggle, played a central role in the response to the Crusades. While jihad can have various meanings, including personal spiritual struggle, it was often understood in this context as a religiously sanctioned military effort to defend and expand the Muslim community, or ummah. For Muslim leaders like Saladin, the defense of Jerusalem and the Holy Land was framed as a sacred duty, similar to the Christian concept of crusading. Saladin's rise to power and his success in uniting the Muslim territories under his rule were deeply connected to his ability to present the struggle against the Crusaders as a unifying religious cause. He called for a greater jihad to reclaim the lands that had been lost to the Crusaders and to protect the Muslim holy sites. The recapture of Jerusalem was seen as a critical objective, both for its religious significance and for its symbolic value as a victory over the Christian forces. Religious scholars and clerics in the Muslim world played a significant role in promoting and legitimizing jihad. They provided religious justifications for warfare against the Crusaders, emphasizing the importance of defending Islamic lands from foreign invaders. This religious rhetoric was instrumental in rallying support for Saladin's campaigns and in uniting various Muslim factions that had previously been divided by internal conflicts. Religious tolerance and dhimmi status. Despite the focus on jihad, the Muslim world was also characterized by a degree of religious tolerance, particularly in the treatment of non-Muslim communities under Muslim rule. Christians and Jews, known as dhimmis, were granted protection and allowed to practice their religions in exchange for paying a special tax, the jizya. This system of religious tolerance was rooted in Islamic law and was generally respected by Muslim rulers, including Saladin. Under Saladin's rule, Jerusalem and other cities in the Muslim territories were home to diverse religious communities. While the relationship between these communities could be tense, especially during times of conflict, there was a long tradition of coexistence that was maintained even during the Crusades. Saladin himself was known for his chivalrous treatment of his Christian enemies and for his respect for the holy sites of other religions. The role of Sufism in Islamic piety. The period before the Third Crusade also saw the flourishing of Sufism, a mystical branch of Islam that emphasized personal devotion, spiritual purification, and the pursuit of a direct, personal experience of God. Sufism played an important role in the religious life of the Muslim world, influencing both rulers and the general population. Sufi orders and their leaders, known as sheikhs, were often involved in promoting the idea of jihad as a spiritual struggle as well as a physical one. They provided moral and spiritual support to those fighting in the wars against the Crusaders, framing the conflict as part of a larger cosmic struggle between the forces of Islam and the infidels. Sufism's emphasis on piety, self-discipline, and the rejection of worldly distractions resonated with the broader call to defend the Islamic faith. In addition to Sufism, other forms of Islamic piety, including the study of the Quran, the Hadith, sayings of the Prophet Muhammad, and Islamic jurisprudence, were central to the religious life of the Muslim world during this period. Religious scholars, known as ulama, played a key role in interpreting Islamic law and providing guidance to both rulers and the general population. Their support for the jihad against the Crusaders helped to legitimize and sustain the military efforts of leaders like Saladin. Interfaith relations and tensions. The period before the Third Crusade was marked by a complex and often contentious relationship between the Christian and Muslim worlds. The Crusades themselves were a manifestation of the deep religious divide between these two civilizations, but they also facilitated a certain degree of cultural and intellectual exchange. Both sides were influenced by the other's religious and cultural practices, leading to a mingling of ideas and traditions in certain areas. However, the religious tensions were undeniable, and these tensions often erupted into violence and persecution. The capture of Jerusalem by Saladin in 1187, for example, was followed by a relatively lenient treatment of the city's Christian inhabitants, in contrast to the massacre that occurred when the Crusaders first captured the city in 1099. Despite this, the overarching narrative on both sides was one of a religiously motivated struggle, with each viewing the other as a threat to their faith and way of life. The period leading up to the Third Crusade was marked by a series of events and developments that set the stage for one of the most significant military campaigns of the medieval period. This process involved increasing tensions, key battles, and important decisions by the major players in both the Christian and Muslim worlds. Here's a detailed account of the process leading up to the Third Crusade. The fall of Jerusalem and the Battle of Hattin. The immediate catalyst for the Third Crusade was the catastrophic loss of Jerusalem to Saladin in 1187. However, the roots of this event can be traced back to earlier conflicts and the weakening of the Crusader states over the preceding decades. In the 1180s, the Kingdom of Jerusalem was already in a fragile state. The death of King Baldwin IV, who had been a capable leader despite his leprosy, left a power vacuum that was not adequately filled by his successors. Baldwin V, his young successor, died in 1186, leading to a contentious succession crisis that saw Guy of Lusignan ascend to the throne. Guy's rule was marked by internal divisions and a lack of strong leadership, which further weakened the kingdom. During this time, Saladin, the Sultan of Egypt and Syria, had been steadily consolidating his power and uniting the Muslim territories under his leadership. His goal was clear: to reclaim Jerusalem and other territories lost to the Crusaders. Saladin's military campaigns were characterized by strategic patience and careful planning, allowing him to build a formidable force that could challenge the Crusader states. The turning point came with the Battle of Hattin on July 4, 1187. The Crusader army, led by Guy of Lusignan, made a fatal error by marching into the arid plains near the Sea of Galilee without adequate water supplies. Saladin's forces, well prepared and tactically superior, surrounded the Crusaders and inflicted a devastating defeat. The Christian forces were almost entirely wiped out, and King Guy was captured along with many of his knights. The loss at Hattin was catastrophic for the Crusader states. With their army decimated, the way was open for Saladin to take Jerusalem. On October 2nd, 1187, after a short siege, Jerusalem fell to Saladin. Unlike the Crusaders' brutal capture of the city in 1099, Saladin's recapture was marked by relative leniency. He allowed the city's Christian inhabitants to leave or remain under Muslim rule, and he respected the holy sites of all religions. Nevertheless, the loss of Jerusalem sent shockwaves throughout the Christian world. The papal response and the call for a crusade. The fall of Jerusalem was met with despair and outrage in Europe. The city was not just a strategic military objective, it was the spiritual heart of Christendom, the site of Jesus Christ's crucifixion and resurrection. The news of its loss led to widespread calls for a new crusade to reclaim the city and restore Christian control over the Holy Land. Pope Urban III is said to have died of grief upon hearing of the loss of Jerusalem, and his successor, Pope Gregory VIII, immediately began organizing a response. On October 29, 1187, Pope Gregory issued the papal bull Audita Tremendi, which called for a new crusade to recover Jerusalem. The bull framed the loss of Jerusalem as a divine punishment for the sins of Christendom and called on all Christians to take up arms in a holy war to atone for those sins and reclaim the city. The call to arms was enthusiastically received across Europe. The idea of the crusade had deep roots in the medieval mindset, combining religious fervor with the promise of spiritual rewards. For many, participating in a crusade was seen as a way to demonstrate their piety and earn salvation. The Church's endorsement of the crusade, including promises of indulgences and the remission of sins, helped to galvanize support. The leaders take up the cross. The response to the papal call was swift and widespread. Three of the most powerful monarchs in Europe, Richard I of England, Philip II of France, and Frederick I Barbarossa, the Holy Roman Emperor, took up the cross and pledged to lead their armies to the Holy Land. Richard I of England, known as Richard the Lionheart, was one of the first to respond. Richard had long been committed to the idea of crusading, and his ascension to the English throne in 1189 only strengthened his resolve. He saw the crusade as both a religious duty and an opportunity to enhance his reputation as a warrior king. Richard immediately began preparations, raising funds and gathering a formidable army. Philip II of France also took up the cross, though his motivations were more complex. Philip recognized the political benefits of joining the crusade, particularly in strengthening his position in Europe and asserting his leadership over the French nobility. Despite his long-standing rivalry with Richard, Philip agreed to join forces with the English king in the common cause of reclaiming Jerusalem. Frederick I Barbarossa, the Holy Roman Emperor, was the third major monarch to take up the cross. Frederick was an experienced and seasoned ruler, having participated in previous crusades. His decision to join the Third Crusade was driven by a combination of religious devotion and a desire to restore the prestige of the Holy Roman Empire. Frederick's participation was seen as a major boost for the crusading effort, as he commanded one of the largest and most experienced armies in Europe. The first 2 months of the Third Crusade were marked by intense preparations, the assembly of vast armies, and the early stages of the journey to the Holy Land. These initial steps were crucial in setting the tone for the entire campaign, as the leaders of the crusade faced logistical challenges, diplomatic negotiations, and the first encounters with the realities of their mission. June 1190, departure and early challenges. The official start of the Third Crusade is often marked by the departure of the armies from Europe. By June 1190, the three main leaders of the crusade, Frederick I Barbarossa, Richard I of England, and Philip II of France, had all committed to the mission and were making final preparations to set out for the Holy Land. Frederick I Barbarossa was the first to depart. Leading one of the largest armies, estimated to be between 15,000 and 20,000 men, Frederick began his overland journey toward the Levant. His route took him through the Balkans, where he had to negotiate passage with the Byzantine Empire, which was wary of large foreign armies moving through its territory. Frederick's diplomatic skills were put to the test as he dealt with the complexities of ensuring safe passage while maintaining the morale and discipline of his troops. The journey through the Balkans was arduous. The terrain was difficult, and the logistics of moving such a large army were challenging. Supplies were stretched thin, and Frederick's forces faced occasional skirmishes with local forces who were hostile to the idea of a foreign army passing through their lands. Despite these difficulties, Frederick pressed on, determined to reach the Holy Land and fulfill his vow to reclaim Jerusalem. Meanwhile, Richard I of England and Philip II of France were making preparations to depart by sea. Their rivalry, which had simmered for years, was a potential source of tension, but both kings were aware of the importance of presenting a united front in the early stages of the crusade. They met in Vézelay, France, in July 1190 to formally take up the cross together and pledge their commitment to the cause. The departure of Richard and Philip was delayed by the need to raise additional funds and gather supplies. Both kings imposed heavy taxes on their subjects to finance the crusade, a move that was unpopular but necessary to sustain such a large and long-term military expedition. Richard, in particular, sold lands and titles, including royal holdings in Normandy, to ensure that he had the resources needed for the campaign. July 1190, the journey begins. In early July 1190, Richard and Philip finally set sail for the Holy Land. Their route took them first to the Mediterranean, where they planned to stop in Sicily before continuing to the Levant. The sea journey was fraught with its own challenges, including unpredictable weather, the risk of shipwrecks, and the need to maintain the cohesion of a large fleet over a long distance. As Richard and Philip sailed towards Sicily, Frederick Barbarossa was making his way through Anatolia, a region that was particularly treacherous for his army. The mountainous terrain, coupled with the summer heat, made the journey difficult and exhausting. Moreover, Frederick's forces faced harassment from Turkish forces who sought to slow their advance and inflict casualties. By late July, Frederick's army had reached the Salaf River in southern Anatolia. Here, tragedy struck. Frederick, who was in his late 60s and one of the most seasoned leaders of the crusade, drowned while attempting to cross the river. His death was a devastating blow to the morale of his army and had significant implications for the Third Crusade as a whole. With Frederick's death, the cohesion of the German crusading force began to unravel. Many of the troops, demoralized by the loss of their leader, decided to return home rather than continue to the Holy Land. Others pressed on under the command of Frederick's son, Duke Frederick VI of Swabia, but the overall strength of the German contingent was severely diminished. August 1190, regrouping and consolidation. In August 1190, Richard and Philip arrived in Sicily, where they were joined by the remnants of the German forces. The death of Frederick Barbarossa overshadowed the early days of the Crusade, and the leaders now faced the challenge of regrouping and consolidating their forces before continuing to the Levant. Sicily, ruled by King Tancred of Lecce, became the site of diplomatic negotiations and strategic planning. Richard and Philip had different priorities, and their rivalry began to surface as they debated the best course of action. Richard, eager to assert his authority, began to make decisions independently, which irritated Philip and threatened the unity of the crusading effort. During their stay in Sicily, tensions between Richard and Philip continued to simmer. Richard's engagement to Philip's sister, Alice, was a particular point of contention. Richard had been betrothed to Alice for many years, but he now sought to annul the engagement in favor of marrying Berengaria of Navarre. This issue, along with disputes over the distribution of resources and command authority, strained the relationship between the two kings. Despite these internal conflicts, the Crusaders continued to prepare for the next leg of their journey. Sicily provided a relatively safe harbor where they could rest, resupply, and repair their ships. The leaders also took the opportunity to negotiate with local powers and secure alliances that would be beneficial once they reached the Holy Land. By the end of August 1190, Richard and Philip were ready to depart Sicily and continue their journey. Their next destination was Cyprus, which Richard would soon capture and use as a strategic base for the crusade. The early months of the Third Crusade had been challenging, marked by the death of a key leader, internal rivalries, and the logistical difficulties of moving large armies across vast distances. However, the Crusaders remained determined to reach the Holy Land and fulfill their mission to reclaim Jerusalem. As September 1190 unfolded, the Crusaders continued their journey towards the Holy Land, navigating both physical and political challenges. Richard the Lionheart and Philip II of France, having regrouped in Sicily, set their sights on Cyprus, an island that would soon play a pivotal role in the Third Crusade. The journey was fraught with difficulties, but it also offered opportunities for the Crusaders to strengthen their position before confronting Saladin's forces. After leaving Sicily, Richard and his fleet encountered a severe storm that scattered their ships across the Mediterranean. Some of Richard's vessels were driven off course and landed on the shores of Cyprus, which at that time was ruled by Isaac Komnenos, a Byzantine prince who had declared himself the island's independent ruler. Isaac's rule had been marked by tyranny, and he was eager to exploit the situation for his own gain. When Richard's ships arrived on Cyprus, Isaac initially feigned hospitality, but soon revealed his true intentions. He seized several of Richard's ships and imprisoned their crews, including some high-ranking nobles and a large portion of the crusading treasure. Richard, who had finally reached the island after the storm, was furious. Rather than negotiate, he chose to take decisive military action. Richard launched a swift and brutal campaign against Isaac, demonstrating his characteristic military prowess. Within a short period, Richard's forces captured key strongholds on the island, forcing Isaac to surrender. In an act of symbolic dominance, Richard famously bound Isaac with silver chains, as he had promised not to shackle him with iron. Cyprus was now under Richard's control, providing the Crusaders with a valuable strategic base and a new source of wealth to fund the ongoing campaign. Meanwhile, tensions between Richard and Philip continued to simmer. The rivalry between the two kings, which had been apparent since the beginning of the Crusade, was exacerbated by Richard's independent actions in Cyprus. Philip, who had continued on to the Levant, was frustrated by Richard's decisions and what he perceived as a lack of coordination. Despite these tensions, both leaders understood the importance of maintaining a united front against their common enemy, Saladin. As October 1190 began, Richard consolidated his control over Cyprus, establishing it as a key supply and staging area for the Crusader forces. The island's resources, its ports, provisions, and strategic location were critical to sustaining the crusade. Richard's capture of Cyprus was seen as a significant achievement, both militarily and politically. It bolstered his reputation as a capable and decisive leader, and it provided the Crusaders with a secure base from which to launch their operations in the Holy Land. In addition to its strategic importance, Cyprus also became the scene of Richard's marriage to Berengaria of Navarre. The marriage was both a personal and political union, as Berengaria's family connections in Europe were valuable allies. The wedding took place with great ceremony, further establishing Richard's authority and legitimacy as the leader of the crusade. However, this event also deepened the rift between Richard and Philip, as Richard's previous engagement to Philip's sister Alice had been a source of tension between the two monarchs. While Richard was securing Cyprus, Philip had already reached Acre, where the siege of Acre had been ongoing since 1189. The siege was one of the most critical battles of the Third Crusade, as Acre was a key coastal city that controlled access to the interior of the Levant. The city had been under Muslim control since 1187, and its recapture was seen as essential for the Crusaders' efforts to regain Jerusalem. Philip's arrival at Acre brought much-needed reinforcements to the beleaguered Crusader forces already engaged in the siege. Despite the ongoing rivalry with Richard, Philip committed his troops to the siege, recognizing the importance of capturing the city. The Crusaders, now bolstered by the French king's forces, intensified their efforts to break through Acre's formidable defenses. Richard's forces soon joined Philip at Acre, bringing with them the supplies and troops secured from Cyprus. The combined might of the English and French armies, along with the other Crusader forces, began to turn the tide in favor of the Crusaders. The siege intensified, with both sides suffering heavy casualties as they fought for control of the city's walls and fortifications. The arrival of Richard and the fresh troops he brought marked a turning point in the siege. Richard's leadership and military experience, coupled with the resources from Cyprus, gave the Crusaders a new momentum. The months of September and October 1190 were characterized by relentless assaults on Acre, as the Crusaders sought to break the Muslim garrison's resistance. The city's defenders, loyal to Saladin, fought fiercely, aware that Acre's fall would be a significant blow to Muslim control of the region. By the end of October 1190, Acre's defenses were beginning to crumble under the sustained pressure from the Crusaders. The city was on the brink of falling, and both sides knew that the outcome of the siege would have far-reaching consequences for the entire crusade. For the Crusaders, the capture of Acre was essential not only for its strategic value but also as a symbolic victory that would restore hope and morale after the losses of the previous years. As the Crusaders prepared for the final assault on Acre, the first 2 months of the Third Crusade had already seen significant developments. The loss of Frederick Barbarossa, the capture of Cyprus, and the intense fighting at Acre set the stage for what would become one of the most famous and challenging campaigns in medieval history. The coming months would test the resolve of the Crusaders and their ability to work together despite their rivalries and the formidable opposition they faced. As November 1190 began, the Crusaders were fully engaged in the Siege of Acre, one of the most pivotal and grueling battles of the Third Crusade. The city of Acre, with its strategic location on the Mediterranean coast, had been under Muslim control since 1187, and its recapture was seen as a crucial step towards reclaiming Jerusalem. The siege, which had already lasted over a year, was now entering its most intense phase, with both sides fully committed to the struggle. The combined forces of Richard the Lionheart and Philip II of France, along with the remnants of Frederick Barbarossa's German contingent and other Crusader troops, continued their relentless assaults on the city's formidable defenses. The walls of Acre were heavily fortified, and the Muslim garrison, loyal to Saladin, put up a fierce resistance. The Crusaders knew that breaking through these defenses would require not only brute force but also careful strategy and coordination. Richard, with his characteristic energy and military acumen, took an active role in directing the siege operations. He ordered the construction of massive siege engines, including trebuchets and battering rams, to breach the city's walls. These engines were manned by experienced engineers and soldiers who worked tirelessly day and night to weaken the defenses. The Crusaders also began to dig tunnels beneath the walls, attempting to undermine the fortifications and cause sections of the walls to collapse. The weather, however, was not on the Crusaders' side. November and December brought heavy rains and cold winds, turning the siege camps into quagmires of mud and filth. The soldiers, already exhausted from the long months of fighting, now had to contend with disease and hunger as supplies dwindled. The conditions in the Crusader camp were harsh, with many soldiers falling ill or succumbing to the elements. Despite these hardships, the resolve to capture Acre remained strong. Inside the city, the situation was equally dire. The Muslim defenders, though well supplied initially, were beginning to feel the strain of the prolonged siege. Saladin, aware of the critical importance of Acre, made several attempts to relieve the city, sending reinforcements and supplies to bolster the garrison. However, his forces were repeatedly repelled by the Crusaders, who had established strong defensive positions around the city to prevent any relief efforts from reaching the besieged garrison. During these months, the siege became a brutal war of attrition. The Crusaders launched frequent assaults on the walls, often resulting in bloody hand-to-hand combat as they tried to scale the fortifications or breach the gates. The defenders responded with equal ferocity, using boiling oil, stones, and arrows to repel the attackers. Casualties on both sides were heavy, and the siege took a psychological toll on everyone involved. As the end of the year approached, the leaders of the Crusade, particularly Richard and Philip, faced increasing pressure to achieve a breakthrough. Their armies were suffering, and the morale of their troops was beginning to waver. The rivalry between Richard and Philip, which had been a persistent undercurrent throughout the campaign, threatened to boil over as they disagreed on strategy and the distribution of resources. Philip, who had been growing increasingly frustrated with the prolonged nature of the siege and the lack of progress, began to make plans to return to France. His health was deteriorating, and he was eager to secure his interests back home, particularly in the face of the growing power of Richard. Despite his frustrations, Philip continued to support the siege, but his commitment to the crusade was waning. Richard, on the other hand, remained determined to capture Acre at all costs. He knew that a victory here would not only be a significant strategic gain, but also a major boost to his reputation as a warrior king. Richard's leadership during these difficult months was characterized by his hands-on approach, often leading his men in the assaults and personally overseeing the construction and use of siege engines. By late December, the Crusaders had made significant progress. Several sections of Acre's walls had been breached, and the Crusaders managed to establish footholds within the city. The fighting now shifted to the narrow streets and alleyways of Acre, where the Crusaders faced fierce resistance from the defenders who were determined to hold every inch of ground. The battle for Acre became a brutal and chaotic struggle, with neither side willing to concede defeat. As the year drew to a close, the situation in Acre was increasingly desperate for both the Crusaders and the defenders. The Crusaders were on the brink of capturing the city, but their forces were exhausted and their supplies nearly depleted. Inside the city, the Muslim garrison, cut off from reinforcements and supplies, was nearing the limits of its endurance. The fall of Acre seemed inevitable, but the exact timing and outcome remained uncertain. The last 2 months of 1190 had been some of the most challenging and hard-fought of the entire Third Crusade. The siege of Acre tested the resolve and endurance of everyone involved, from the highest-ranking leaders to the common soldiers. As the new year approached, the Crusaders knew that they were on the cusp of a crucial victory, one that could reshape the entire course of the crusade and their efforts to reclaim Jerusalem. As January 1191 began, the siege of Acre entered its final, most grueling phase. The Crusaders, now firmly entrenched around the city, intensified their efforts to break the Muslim garrison's resistance. The winter months, though harsh, provided a temporary reprieve from the sweltering heat of the Levantine summer, allowing the Crusaders to push their assault with renewed vigor. However, the challenges of supply shortages, disease, and internal discord continued to plague the besieging forces. Richard the Lionheart, despite the difficult conditions, remained resolute in his leadership. He personally oversaw the continued use of siege engines, including the powerful trebuchets that relentlessly pounded Acre's walls. The Crusaders also continued their efforts to undermine the city's defenses by digging tunnels beneath the walls, hoping to cause sections of the fortifications to collapse. These efforts were met with fierce resistance from the defenders, who countered the Crusaders' every move with their own defensive tactics. Inside Acre, the situation was increasingly dire. The Muslim garrison, cut off from significant reinforcements due to the Crusaders' effective blockade, was running low on supplies. Food and fresh water were scarce, and the defenders were suffering from the same diseases and hardships that afflicted the Crusaders outside the walls. Saladin, who was camped nearby with his forces, made several attempts to break through the Crusader lines and relieve the city, but each effort was repelled, further weakening the morale of the defenders. Despite these conditions, the defenders of Acre fought on with remarkable tenacity. They knew that the city's fall would be a significant blow to Saladin's control over the region, and they were determined to hold out as long as possible. The fighting in January and February 1191 was brutal, with close-quarters combat becoming increasingly common as the Crusaders breached more sections of the walls. The narrow streets of Acre became battlefields, where every building and alleyway was fiercely contested. As the siege dragged on, the internal tensions among the Crusaders continued to simmer. Richard's increasingly dominant role in the campaign did not sit well with Philip II of France, who had grown increasingly frustrated with the lack of progress and his diminishing influence. Philip's health was also in decline, and by February, he had begun to make serious plans to return to France, leaving Richard to lead the crusade on his own. Philip's departure from the Holy Land would have significant implications for the crusade. While he had been a key player in the initial stages of the campaign, his rivalry with Richard and his focus on his interests back in France ultimately led him to abandon the crusade before its conclusion. However, before he left, Philip ensured that his troops would continue to support the crusade, leaving behind a contingent under the command of his trusted nobles. Richard, meanwhile, continued to rally his forces for what he knew would be the final push to capture Acre. The arrival of reinforcements from Europe, although delayed, provided a much-needed boost to the Crusader forces. These fresh troops helped to replace the losses suffered during the long siege and brought with them additional supplies, which were crucial as the Crusaders prepared for the final assault. By mid-February 1191, the situation inside Acre had become untenable for the defenders. The relentless pressure from the Crusaders, combined with the worsening conditions inside the city, led many of the defenders to consider surrender. Saladin, aware that Acre could not hold out much longer, attempted one last effort to break the siege, launching a large-scale attack on the Crusader lines. This assault, however, was repelled with heavy losses, further demoralizing the Muslim forces. As February drew to a close, the Crusaders began to prepare for a final, all-out assault on Acre. The walls, weakened by months of bombardment, were on the verge of collapse in several places, and the defenders were exhausted. Richard and his commanders planned a coordinated attack that would breach the city's remaining defenses and force the garrison to surrender. The anticipation of victory brought a renewed sense of urgency to the Crusader camp. Soldiers and knights who had endured the long months of siege were eager to bring the campaign to a successful conclusion. However, the leaders were also aware that even with Acre's capture, the road to Jerusalem would be long and difficult, with many challenges still ahead. As the Crusaders prepared for the final assault, the tension in the camp was palpable. Everyone knew that the outcome of this siege would have a profound impact on the entire Third Crusade. A victory at Acre would not only secure a vital strategic position but also restore the Crusaders' morale and provide a base of operations for further campaigns in the Holy Land. Conversely, a failure to capture the city would be a devastating blow to their efforts. By the end of February 1191, the stage was set for the climactic battle that would decide the fate of Acre. The Crusaders, despite their hardships, were determined to achieve victory, while the defenders, though weary and outnumbered, remained defiant. The next few weeks would be crucial in determining the course of the Third Crusade and the future of the Crusader states in the Holy Land. As March 1191 began, the siege of Acre was reaching its climax. The Crusaders, under the determined leadership of Richard the Lionheart, were preparing for a final, decisive assault on the city. The long months of siege had taken a heavy toll on both the besiegers and the defenders, but the Crusaders were now more determined than ever to break the stalemate and capture Acre. The Crusaders intensified their bombardment of the city, using their siege engines to relentlessly pound the already weakened walls of Acre. The sound of trebuchets hurling stones, the crash of collapsing masonry, and the cries of soldiers filled the air day and night. Richard directed the operations with his characteristic energy, ensuring that no opportunity to breach the walls was missed. The morale among the Crusader troops, bolstered by the prospect of victory, remained high despite the continued hardships. Inside the city, the situation was desperate. The Muslim garrison, though exhausted and short on supplies, continued to mount a fierce resistance. The defenders were fully aware that the fall of Acre would be a significant blow to Saladin's control over the region, and they fought with the tenacity of men with nothing left to lose. Despite their efforts, however, the continuous pressure from the Crusaders began to wear down their defenses. As the weeks of March progressed, several sections of Acre's walls finally gave way under the relentless bombardment. The Crusaders seized the opportunity to launch full-scale assaults on the breaches. These attacks led to intense hand-to-hand combat within the city as the Crusaders fought to establish control over the streets and buildings. The narrow alleys and fortified structures of Acre became the setting for brutal skirmishes, with neither side willing to concede ground. During these battles, Richard the Lionheart demonstrated his personal bravery, often leading his men from the front. His presence on the battlefield inspired his troops and added to his growing reputation as one of the most formidable military leaders of the time. However, the fighting was fierce, and the Crusaders faced strong resistance from the defenders, who used every tactic available to slow their advance. By early April 1191, it became clear that the Crusaders were gaining the upper hand. The defenders of Acre, now isolated and unable to receive significant reinforcements from Saladin, were running out of options. The city's remaining fortifications were in ruins, and the garrison was exhausted, with many soldiers wounded or killed. Despite this, they continued to hold out, hoping for a miracle that might turn the tide in their favor. Saladin, aware of the critical situation in Acre, made several attempts to negotiate a truce or offer terms of surrender that would allow the garrison to evacuate with honor. However, Richard and the Crusader leaders, sensing imminent victory, were in no mood for compromise. They demanded an unconditional surrender, insisting that the city be handed over to Crusader control. As negotiations dragged on without resolution, Richard decided to launch one final, massive assault to break the remaining resistance. This assault, which took place in mid-April, was carefully planned and coordinated. The Crusaders concentrated their forces on the most vulnerable sections of the city's defenses, using their siege engines to create breaches and sending waves of soldiers through the gaps. The final battle for Acre was a brutal and chaotic affair. The Crusaders, desperate to bring the siege to an end, fought with everything they had. The defenders, though outnumbered and outgunned, continued to resist fiercely, aware that surrender would mean the loss of the city and potentially their lives. The fighting spread throughout Acre, with the Crusaders gradually gaining control of key areas. By the end of April 1191, the resistance within Acre had been effectively crushed. The city's leaders, recognizing that further resistance was futile, finally agreed to surrender. On April 25, 1191, Acre officially fell to the Crusaders, marking a significant victory in the Third Crusade. The city, once a key stronghold for Saladin's forces, was now under Christian control. The fall of Acre was a momentous event. It marked the first major victory for the Crusaders since the beginning of the Third Crusade and provided them with a crucial foothold in the Holy Land. The capture of the city also had symbolic importance, as it restored some of the Crusaders' lost prestige and demonstrated their ability to challenge Saladin's dominance in the region. In the aftermath of the victory, Richard and the other Crusader leaders moved quickly to consolidate their control over Acre. The city was fortified, and its defenses were repaired and strengthened to ensure that it could withstand any counterattacks from Saladin's forces. The Crusaders also secured the city's ports, which would serve as vital supply lines for the ongoing campaign. However, the victory at Acre also highlighted the underlying tensions within the Crusader camp. Philip II of France, whose relationship with Richard had grown increasingly strained, decided to leave the Holy Land shortly after the city's capture. He cited ill health and pressing concerns in France as his reasons for departure, but his decision left Richard as the sole leader of the crusade. Philip's departure was a significant blow to the unity of the crusading effort, and it placed even greater responsibility on Richard's shoulders. As May 1191 began, Richard was left to contemplate the next steps in the crusade. The capture of Acre was a major success, but the ultimate goal of the crusade, the recapture of Jerusalem, still lay ahead. The victory had provided the Crusaders with a much-needed boost, but the road to Jerusalem would be long and fraught with challenges. Richard, now the undisputed leader of the crusade, would need to navigate both the military and political obstacles that lay in his path if he was to achieve his goal. As May 1191 unfolded, the Crusaders, now in control of Acre, turned their attention to the next phase of their campaign. The fall of Acre had been a significant victory, but the ultimate goal of the Third Crusade, recapturing Jerusalem, still loomed large. Richard the Lionheart, now the primary leader of the crusading forces following Philip II's departure, faced the daunting task of organizing the next steps toward Jerusalem while managing the complex dynamics within the Crusader camp. With Acre secure, Richard focused on consolidating his control over the city and preparing his forces for the march south. Acre's strategic location made it an ideal base of operations, and Richard ordered the fortification of the city's defenses to protect against any potential counterattacks by Saladin. The Crusaders also worked to restore the city's infrastructure, repairing the damage done during the siege and ensuring that the port was fully operational to receive supplies and reinforcements from Europe. Throughout May, Richard held councils with the remaining Crusader leaders, including those from the German and French contingents, as well as the leaders of the military orders such as the Knights Templar and the Hospitallers. These discussions focused on the strategy for the upcoming campaign. The Crusaders faced several critical decisions, including the best route to take toward Jerusalem, how to manage their limited resources, and whether to engage Saladin's forces in open battle or focus on capturing key fortresses along the way. Richard's leadership was instrumental during this period. His reputation as a brilliant military strategist and fearless warrior inspired confidence among his troops, even as the challenges ahead seemed overwhelming. However, Richard was also aware of the divisions within the Crusader camp. The departure of Philip II had left a power vacuum, and there were tensions between the various factions, each with their own priorities and loyalties. Meanwhile, Saladin, though shaken by the loss of Acre, was far from defeated. He had retreated to the interior, gathering his forces and preparing for the inevitable confrontation with the Crusaders as they advanced toward Jerusalem. Saladin understood that the Crusaders would likely attempt to capture key fortresses and cities along the coastal route, and he began to fortify his positions in preparation for a protracted conflict. He also continued to harass the Crusaders with raids and skirmishes, aiming to wear them down and delay their advance. By June 1191, the Crusaders were ready to move south from Acre. Richard, ever the tactician, chose to advance along the coast, where the Crusader fleet could provide support and ensure a steady flow of supplies. This decision reflected Richard's understanding of the logistical challenges of maintaining a large army in hostile territory. By keeping close to the coast, the Crusaders could avoid the difficult inland terrain and remain within reach of their naval support. The march south was slow and deliberate, as Richard took care to maintain the discipline and cohesion of his forces. The Crusaders moved in a tight formation, with heavy cavalry and infantry protecting the flanks and rear, while the vanguard scouted ahead to identify potential threats. Along the way, the Crusaders encountered several small Muslim garrisons, which were quickly overwhelmed. Richard ordered the capture and fortification of these positions, ensuring that the Crusaders had secure bases as they moved closer to their ultimate goal. During the march, the Crusaders also encountered several challenges. The summer heat was intense, and the lack of fresh water and provisions began to take a toll on the troops. Richard's attention to detail and his insistence on maintaining strict discipline were crucial in keeping the army together. He made sure that water supplies were rationed carefully and that the men were rotated regularly to prevent exhaustion. Despite these efforts, the conditions were harsh, and the morale of the troops was tested by the slow progress and the constant threat of attack from Saladin's forces. Saladin, aware of the Crusaders' advance, continued his strategy of harassment and attrition. His forces launched frequent raids on the Crusader columns, striking quickly and then retreating before the Crusaders could mount a full response. These skirmishes, though small in scale, were designed to disrupt the Crusaders' march and sap their strength. Saladin's goal was to delay the Crusaders as much as possible, giving him time to gather a larger force for a decisive battle. As the Crusaders advanced, they captured several important coastal towns and fortresses, further securing their supply lines. Each victory brought them closer to Jerusalem, but it also increased the pressure on Saladin to respond. The Muslim leader knew that he could not allow the Crusaders to reach Jerusalem unopposed, and he began to prepare for a major confrontation. By the end of June, the Crusaders had reached the vicinity of Arsuf, a coastal town north of Jaffa. This location was significant as it provided the Crusaders with a strategic position from which to launch further operations. Richard recognized the importance of controlling Arsuf, both for its defensive value as a staging ground for future attacks on Saladin's forces. Throughout July, the Crusaders focused on fortifying their position around Arsuf. Richard's meticulous planning and his attention to the logistical needs of his army ensured that the Crusaders were well prepared for the challenges ahead. However, the strain of the long march and the constant skirmishing with Saladin's forces had taken a toll on the Crusader army. Richard knew that a decisive battle with Saladin was looming, and he needed to ensure that his forces were ready for the confrontation. As August 1191 approached, tensions were high on both sides. The Crusaders had made significant progress, but they were still far from Jerusalem, and the road ahead was fraught with danger. Saladin, though determined to stop the Crusaders, was also aware of the difficulties his forces faced in maintaining a prolonged defense. Both leaders understood that the coming months would be critical in determining the outcome of the Third Crusade. Richard spent the last days of July making final preparations for the inevitable battle. He ensured that his troops were well rested and that supplies were stockpiled in anticipation of a prolonged engagement. The Crusaders, despite the hardships they had endured, remained committed to their mission, inspired by the leadership of Richard and the prospect of reclaiming Jerusalem. As the summer heat bore down on the Holy Land, both armies braced for the clash that would determine the fate of the crusade. The months of May through July 1191 had been a time of strategic maneuvering and preparation, but the time for planning was drawing to a close. The stage was set for one of the most famous battles of the Third Crusade, and the eyes of the world were once again focused on the struggle for control of the Holy Land. As August 1191 began, the tension between the Crusaders and Saladin's forces was palpable. Both sides were preparing for what would likely be a decisive confrontation. Richard the Lionheart, aware of the strategic importance of maintaining momentum, continued to push his forces south along the coast, with his eyes set on Jaffa, a key city that would provide a critical stronghold and secure the Crusaders' position closer to Jerusalem. The march toward Jaffa was not without its challenges. The summer heat in the Levant was oppressive, and the Crusaders, already weary from months of campaigning, struggled with the harsh conditions. Richard, understanding the importance of keeping morale high, enforced strict discipline and made sure that his troops were well supplied with water and provisions. He also ensured that the Crusader army maintained a tight formation to protect against the constant threat of attack from Saladin's forces. Throughout August, Saladin continued his strategy of harassment and delay. His forces launched a series of raids and ambushes on the Crusader column, striking quickly and then retreating before Richard's forces could fully engage them. These skirmishes, though small in scale, were part of Saladin's broader strategy to wear down the Crusaders and prevent them from reaching Jaffa with their full strength. Despite these challenges, Richard's leadership and tactical acumen kept the Crusader army moving forward. The Crusaders were bolstered by their recent successes, including the capture of Acre, and they remained determined to press on toward their ultimate goal of reclaiming Jerusalem. Richard's ability to inspire and motivate his troops was crucial during this period, as the long march and the constant threat of attack took a toll on both the physical and mental endurance of the soldiers. By late August, the Crusaders were approaching the city of Arsuf, a coastal town just north of Jaffa. Richard recognized the strategic importance of this location, as controlling Arsuf would allow the Crusaders to secure their flank and protect their supply lines as they continued their advance. Saladin, fully aware of the significance of Arsuf, prepared to confront the Crusaders in what would become one of the most famous battles of the Third Crusade. On September 7, 1191, the Battle of Arsuf took place. Richard's forces, composed of heavy cavalry, infantry, and archers, faced off against Saladin's army, which included a large number of mounted archers and light cavalry. The battle began with Saladin's forces harassing the Crusader lines with arrows and quick strikes, attempting to break their formation and provoke a disorganized charge. Richard, however, maintained strict control over his forces, resisting the urge to counterattack prematurely. He knew that Saladin's strategy was to lure the Crusaders into breaking formation, which would expose them to devastating attacks from the more mobile Muslim cavalry. Instead, Richard waited patiently, holding his troops in formation and allowing Saladin's forces to come closer. When the time was right, Richard gave the order to charge. The Crusader knights, clad in heavy armor and mounted on powerful warhorses, surged forward in a disciplined and coordinated assault. The charge caught Saladin's forces off guard, and the impact of the heavily armored knights was devastating. The Muslim cavalry, unable to withstand the sheer force of the charge, began to break and retreat. The Battle of Arsuf was a significant victory for the Crusaders. Richard's leadership and tactical brilliance had turned the tide of the battle, and Saladin's forces were forced to withdraw. The victory at Arsuf boosted the morale of the Crusaders and demonstrated that they could defeat Saladin's army in open battle. It also secured the Crusaders' position along the coast and allowed them to continue their advance toward Jaffa. After the battle, Richard quickly moved to consolidate his gains. He ordered the fortification of Arsuf and ensured that his forces were well supplied and prepared for the next stage of the campaign. The victory at Arsuf had secured the Crusaders' flank and protected their supply lines, but Richard knew that the campaign was far from over. Jerusalem was still some distance away, and Saladin, though defeated at Arsuf, remained a formidable opponent. As September drew to a close, the Crusaders advanced toward Jaffa, reaching the city in early October 1191. Jaffa, a vital port city, was lightly defended, and the Crusaders quickly captured it with minimal resistance. Securing Jaffa was a critical step in the campaign, as it provided the Crusaders with a secure base close to Jerusalem and ensured that they could receive supplies and reinforcements from the sea. The capture of Jaffa marked another significant milestone in the Third Crusade. Richard immediately set about fortifying the city and preparing it as a stronghold for the final push toward Jerusalem. The Crusaders, now firmly established along the coast, were in a strong position to continue their advance. However, the approach of winter and the challenges of besieging a heavily fortified city like Jerusalem weighed heavily on Richard's mind. Despite these concerns, the victory at Arsuf and the capture of Jaffa had provided the Crusaders with a much-needed boost. The months of August and September 1191 had been marked by significant successes, and Richard's reputation as a military leader continued to grow. The Crusaders, though weary, were now closer than ever to achieving their ultimate goal. As October began, the Crusaders prepared for the next phase of the campaign. Richard knew that the road to Jerusalem would be difficult, and he would need to carefully plan the next steps to ensure the success of the crusade. The victories of the past months had set the stage for a renewed effort to reclaim the Holy City, but the challenges ahead would require all of Richard's skill and determination. As October 1191 continued, the Crusaders, having secured Jaffa, began to regroup and prepare for the next stage of their campaign, the advance toward Jerusalem. The capture of Jaffa had provided the Crusaders with a vital stronghold and a secure supply line from the Mediterranean, but the path to Jerusalem was still fraught with challenges. Richard the Lionheart, mindful of the difficulties ahead, knew that the success of the Third Crusade depended on careful planning and the ability to maintain the cohesion and morale of his forces. The victory at Arsuf and the subsequent capture of Jaffa had bolstered the Crusaders' confidence, but it also intensified Saladin's resolve to defend Jerusalem. Saladin, though reeling from the recent defeats, was not yet willing to cede control of the Holy City. He understood the symbolic and strategic importance of Jerusalem, and he began to fortify the city's defenses in anticipation of a possible siege. Saladin also continued to monitor the movements of the Crusader forces, preparing to strike whenever an opportunity presented itself. Throughout October, Richard focused on consolidating his hold on Jaffa and ensuring that his troops were well rested and supplied for the grueling march ahead. The Crusaders knew that the road to Jerusalem would be difficult, not only because of the natural obstacles and harsh terrain, but also due to the threat of Saladin's forces, who were likely to harass and attack the Crusaders at every opportunity. Richard's leadership was critical during this time, as he worked to maintain the discipline and morale of his army, knowing that any sign of weakness could lead to disaster. As November began, the Crusaders set out from Jaffa, marching inland toward Jerusalem. The journey was arduous, with the Crusaders navigating through difficult terrain that included hills, valleys, and forests. The cooler autumn weather provided some relief from the summer heat, but it also brought its own challenges, including the risk of sudden rainstorms that could turn the roads into quagmires. Despite these difficulties, Richard kept his forces moving steadily forward, mindful of the need to maintain momentum. Saladin, aware of the Crusaders' movements, employed a strategy of delay and attrition. His forces shadowed the Crusader army, launching hit-and-run attacks designed to slow their advance and weaken their resolve. These skirmishes, though small in scale, were constant and unnerving, forcing the Crusaders to remain on high alert at all times. Saladin's goal was to prevent the Crusaders from reaching Jerusalem with their full strength, and his tactics reflected a deep understanding of the terrain and the vulnerabilities of a large, slow-moving army. Despite Saladin's efforts, the Crusaders made steady progress. Richard's leadership during this period was characterized by his tactical flexibility and his ability to adapt to changing circumstances. He employed a mix of offensive and defensive maneuvers, using his heavy cavalry to repel Saladin's raids while keeping his infantry and supply trains protected. Richard also made sure to secure key positions along the way, establishing temporary fortifications that could serve as defensive outposts in case of a larger attack. By mid-November, the Crusaders had reached the outskirts of Jerusalem, a sight that both inspired and daunted the weary soldiers. The Holy City, with its imposing walls and numerous fortifications, loomed large on the horizon. For many of the Crusaders, this was the moment they had been fighting for, a chance to reclaim the city that held such deep religious significance. However, as they drew closer, the full scale of the challenge before them became apparent. Jerusalem's defenses were formidable, and Saladin had taken every precaution to ensure that the city could withstand a prolonged siege. The Crusaders knew that any attempt to take the city by force would require careful planning, significant resources, and the willingness to endure a potentially long and bloody siege. Moreover, the approach of winter added an additional layer of complexity, as the colder weather and potential for rain and snow would make the logistics of a siege even more difficult. Richard, fully aware of these challenges, convened a council of his top commanders to discuss the next steps. The decision of whether to lay siege to Jerusalem was not taken lightly. The Crusader leaders debated the merits of various strategies, weighing the risks of a direct assault against the possibility of trying to draw Saladin into a pitched battle on more favorable ground. Richard, ever the strategist, understood that a hasty decision could lead to disaster, and he sought to carefully consider all options before committing his forces. As November turned into December, the Crusaders made preparations for a possible siege. They began stockpiling supplies, digging trenches, and constructing siege engines in anticipation of the battles to come. However, Richard remained cautious, knowing that the success of the crusade hinged not just on military strength, but also on maintaining the unity and morale of his army. The Crusaders were already stretched thin, and the prospect of a long, drawn-out siege in harsh winter conditions was daunting. Saladin, for his part, continued to fortify Jerusalem and bolster his forces. He knew that the Crusaders were determined, but he also understood that their resolve could be tested by the difficulties of a winter campaign. Saladin employed a strategy of psychological warfare, using his knowledge of the Crusaders' situation to try to sow doubt and discord among their ranks. He sent emissaries to Richard with offers of negotiation, hoping to delay the Crusaders and buy time to strengthen his position. As December progressed, the Crusaders faced the reality that a siege of Jerusalem during the winter months might not be feasible. The harsh weather, combined with the formidable defenses of the city, made the prospect of a successful assault increasingly unlikely. Richard, ever pragmatic, began to consider alternative strategies. He explored the possibility of securing other key positions in the region, which could weaken Saladin's control and create opportunities for a future campaign in more favorable conditions. By the end of December 1191, the Crusaders were at a crossroads. The approach of Jerusalem had brought them within sight of their ultimate goal, but the realities of the situation forced them to reconsider their plans. Richard, recognizing the need to preserve his forces and avoid unnecessary losses, began to explore the possibility of negotiating with Saladin. The crusade was far from over, but the events of the next few months would be crucial in determining its outcome. As January 1192 began, the Crusaders found themselves facing a difficult and uncertain situation. After months of marching and fighting, they were now encamped near Jerusalem, but the harsh winter conditions and the formidable defenses of the city forced them to reconsider their plans. Richard the Lionheart, the primary leader of the crusade, was acutely aware of the challenges they faced, and the decisions made in these early months of 1192 would shape the course of the entire campaign. The winter weather had made the prospect of a full-scale siege of Jerusalem increasingly unfeasible. The cold, rain, and difficult terrain made it hard to sustain a large army in the field, and the Crusaders were already stretched thin in terms of supplies and morale. Richard, who was known for his strategic thinking, understood that launching an assault under such conditions could lead to heavy losses without guaranteeing success. He began to explore other options, including negotiations with Saladin, the Muslim leader who had so effectively defended Jerusalem and much of the Levant. Richard's initial attempts at negotiation were cautious. He was fully aware of Saladin's strength and the difficulties of besieging such a well-defended city. The two leaders had a mutual respect for each other's abilities, and both understood that the conflict between them could not be resolved easily. Throughout January, envoys traveled between the Crusader camp and Saladin's headquarters, discussing potential terms for a truce or settlement. While neither side was eager to make major concessions, the discussions provided a temporary respite from the constant threat of battle. During this time, the Crusaders focused on fortifying their positions and ensuring that their supply lines remained secure. Richard knew that maintaining the army's strength was crucial, especially as the winter dragged on. He ordered the construction of additional fortifications around their camp, ensuring that they could withstand any surprise attacks from Saladin's forces. The Crusaders also continued to gather intelligence on Jerusalem's defenses, preparing for the possibility that a siege might still be necessary if negotiations failed. As February 1192 arrived, the situation remained tense but relatively stable. The Crusaders had established a secure camp near Jerusalem, but the city remained out of reach. The ongoing negotiations between Richard and Saladin had not yet yielded a breakthrough, and both sides were wary of making any moves that could lead to open conflict. However, the stalemate could not last indefinitely, and Richard knew that he needed to take decisive action to prevent the crusade from losing momentum. One of the key issues that Richard faced was the morale of his troops. The long campaign, harsh winter conditions, and the uncertainty of the situation had begun to wear down the Crusaders' spirits. Many of the soldiers were eager for action, frustrated by the lack of progress and the prospect of spending the winter in a cold, damp camp. Richard understood the importance of maintaining morale, and he took steps to address these concerns, including holding councils with his commanders and encouraging religious observances to keep the men focused on their spiritual mission. At the same time, Richard began to explore alternative strategies for achieving the Crusade's objectives. While the capture of Jerusalem remained the ultimate goal, Richard considered other ways to weaken Saladin's control over the region and improve the Crusaders' position. One option he explored was launching a series of raids and smaller-scale assaults on key fortresses and cities in the surrounding area. These actions could potentially disrupt Saladin's supply lines and force him to divert his forces, creating an opportunity for the Crusaders to strike at Jerusalem later in the year. In mid-February, Richard decided to test this strategy by launching a raid on the fortress of Darum, located to the south of Jerusalem. The fortress was a key point in Saladin's defensive network, and its capture would provide the Crusaders with a strategic advantage. Richard led a small, mobile force on the raid, using speed and surprise to overcome the garrison. The operation was a success, and the Crusaders captured Durham with minimal losses. The victory, though small, boosted the morale of the Crusaders and demonstrated that they could still achieve significant results even without a direct assault on Jerusalem. Saladin, meanwhile, continued to strengthen his defenses around Jerusalem and prepare for the possibility of renewed hostilities. He was well aware of the Crusaders' activities and monitored Richard's movements closely. The capture of Durham was a setback, but Saladin did not overreact. Instead, he focused on consolidating his forces and ensuring that the core of his army remained intact. He understood that the real battle would come when the weather improved and the Crusaders could once again move in force. As February drew to a close, the Crusaders found themselves in a slightly better position than at the start of the year, but the overall situation remained precarious. The raid on Durham had provided a temporary boost, but the larger question of how to take Jerusalem still loomed large. Richard continued to weigh his options, knowing that the decisions he made in the coming months would determine the ultimate outcome of the Third Crusade. In these first 2 months of 1192, the Third Crusade had entered a critical phase. The Crusaders were close to their goal, but the path forward was uncertain, and the challenges they faced were immense. Richard's leadership, marked by a combination of pragmatism and determination, was crucial in keeping the crusade on track, but the ultimate fate of the campaign remained in the balance as the winter months gave way to spring. As March 1192 began, the Crusaders were still encamped near Jerusalem, grappling with the difficult decisions that would shape the future of the Third Crusade. The winter months had been a time of careful maneuvering and strategic deliberation, but as spring approached, the pressure to take decisive action mounted. Richard the Lionheart, ever the strategist, knew that the coming weeks would be crucial in determining the success or failure of the entire campaign. Throughout March, Richard continued his efforts to maintain the morale and cohesion of his forces. The Crusaders, weary from the long months of campaigning and the harsh winter conditions, were eager for progress. The prospect of capturing Jerusalem remained the ultimate goal, but the formidable defenses of the city and the ongoing negotiations with Saladin created a sense of uncertainty. Richard understood that he needed to balance the expectations of his troops with the practical realities of the situation. Saladin, aware that the Crusaders were still a significant threat, kept a close watch on their movements. He continued to reinforce Jerusalem's defenses and positioned his forces strategically around the city to respond to any potential attacks. Saladin's strategy remained one of patience and attrition, aiming to wear down the Crusaders and force them into a situation where they would have to abandon their ambitions or negotiate on terms favorable to the Muslim forces. As the weather improved in March, Richard began to consider a more active approach. The idea of a direct assault on Jerusalem remained daunting, but the possibility of launching further raids and capturing additional strategic positions was appealing. These actions could weaken Saladin's control over the region and potentially force him into a more favorable negotiation position. Richard's focus shifted towards securing key fortresses and cities that could serve as bases for future operations. One of the first targets Richard identified was the city of Ascalon, a crucial coastal fortress located southwest of Jerusalem. Ascalon had previously been in Crusader hands but was recaptured by Saladin in 1187. Its strategic importance lay in its position as a gateway between Egypt and the Levant, making it a vital supply route for Saladin's forces. Richard believed that capturing Ascalon would not only disrupt Saladin's supply lines but also provide the Crusaders with a stronghold from which they could launch future operations against Jerusalem. In late March, Richard led a significant portion of his forces on march toward Ascalon. The journey was challenging, as the Crusaders had to navigate difficult terrain and remain vigilant against potential ambushes from Saladin's forces. However, Richard's leadership and the disciplined organization of the Crusader army ensured that the march proceeded with minimal losses. Upon reaching Ascalon, Richard found that the city's defenses were strong but not impregnable. The siege of Ascalon began in early April 1192. Richard ordered the construction of siege engines and the digging of trenches around the city, preparing for a protracted assault. The Crusaders launched repeated attacks on the city's walls, using battering rams and catapults to weaken the fortifications. The defenders, loyal to Saladin, fought back fiercely, using arrows, stones, and boiling oil to repel the attackers. The siege quickly became a brutal contest of wills, with both sides determined to hold their ground. As the siege progressed, Saladin faced a difficult decision. He could either attempt to relieve Ascalon by sending reinforcements, which would risk a direct confrontation with Richard's forces, or he could continue to fortify Jerusalem and wait for the Crusaders to overextend themselves. Saladin opted for a cautious approach, choosing to send only limited reinforcements to Ascalon while focusing on strengthening Jerusalem's defenses. This decision reflected Saladin's understanding of the broader strategic picture. Jerusalem was the true prize, and he could not afford to weaken its defenses. By mid-April, the Crusaders had made significant progress in breaching Ascalon's defenses. The constant pressure from Richard's forces began to take its toll on the defenders, who were increasingly outnumbered and short on supplies. Richard, sensing that victory was within reach, intensified the assault. The Crusaders launched a final, coordinated attack that overwhelmed the remaining defenders, and by the end of April 1192, Ascalon had fallen to the Crusaders. The capture of Ascalon was a major victory for Richard and the Crusaders. It provided them with a strategic stronghold on the coast, securing their supply lines and giving them a base of operations for future campaigns. The fall of the city also dealt a significant blow to Saladin's control over the region, forcing him to reconsider his strategy and the resources he could commit to defending Jerusalem. With Ascalon secured, Richard turned his attention back to Jerusalem. The success at Ascalon had reinvigorated the Crusaders, boosting their morale and renewing their determination to achieve their ultimate goal. However, the challenges of capturing Jerusalem remained daunting. The city's defenses were formidable, and Saladin's forces were still strong. Richard knew that a direct assault on Jerusalem would be a costly and risky endeavor, and he continued to weigh his options carefully. As April drew to a close, the Crusaders found themselves in a stronger position than they had been at the beginning of the year. The capture of Ascalon had shifted the balance of power, but the road to Jerusalem was still fraught with uncertainty. Richard's leadership and strategic acumen had brought the Crusaders this far, but the final outcome of the Third Crusade was still hanging in the balance. The months of March and April 1192 had seen significant developments in the Crusader campaign. Richard's decision to capture Ascalon had proven to be a wise move, securing a key fortress and weakening Saladin's control over the region. However, the ultimate goal of reclaiming Jerusalem remained elusive, and the challenges ahead would require all of Richard's skill and determination. The stage was set for the final, decisive phase of the Third Crusade, with the fate of the Holy Land hanging in the balance. As May 1192 began, the Crusaders were riding high on the success of their recent capture of Ascalon, a victory that had provided them with a crucial strategic foothold on the coast. With this achievement, Richard the Lionheart's forces were in a stronger position than they had been for months, but the ultimate objective, Jerusalem, remained out of reach. Richard now faced the daunting task of deciding how best to capitalize on the momentum generated by the capture of Ascalon while managing the complex and often conflicting interests within the Crusader ranks. The capture of Ascalon had secured the Crusaders' supply lines and provided a strong defensive position, but it also presented Richard with a difficult strategic dilemma. Jerusalem, though still the ultimate goal, was heavily fortified, and Saladin's forces remained a potent threat. An all-out assault on the city would require immense resources, careful planning, and a level of unity among the Crusaders that was difficult to maintain. Richard was fully aware that a failed attempt to take Jerusalem could spell disaster for the entire crusade. Throughout May, Richard weighed his options. One possibility was to continue to strengthen the Crusaders' hold on the coastal cities, securing a string of fortresses that could provide a buffer against Saladin's forces and ensure a steady flow of supplies from Europe. This strategy would allow the Crusaders to build up their strength and potentially draw Saladin into a battle on more favorable terms. However, this approach also risked prolonging the campaign indefinitely, with no guarantee that Jerusalem would ever be captured. Another option was to negotiate directly with Saladin. Richard had already engaged in intermittent negotiations with Saladin over the previous months, and both leaders had a mutual respect for each other's abilities. Richard knew that a negotiated settlement could provide a way to secure Christian access to Jerusalem without the need for a costly siege. However, negotiating with Saladin would require careful diplomacy, and any agreement would need to satisfy the diverse factions within the Crusader ranks, many of whom were eager for a more decisive military victory. As May turned into June, Richard decided to continue his strategy of fortifying the Crusader-held territories while keeping the option of negotiation open. He ordered the further strengthening of Ascalon's defenses and began to secure additional positions along the coastal route to Jerusalem. These actions were intended to create a solid base of operations from which the Crusaders could launch future offensives, while also providing a safeguard against any potential counterattacks from Saladin. During this period, Richard also faced growing pressure from within the Crusader camp. The various leaders and factions, including the Knights Templar, the Hospitallers, and the French and German contingents, all had their own agendas and priorities. Some were impatient with the perceived lack of progress toward Jerusalem, while others were concerned about the long-term sustainability of the campaign. Richard, as the de facto leader of the crusade, had to navigate these complex dynamics, balancing the need for decisive action with the realities of the situation on the ground. Saladin, meanwhile, continued to fortify Jerusalem and monitor the Crusaders' movements closely. He was acutely aware of the threat posed by Richard's forces, but he also understood that the Crusaders were facing their own internal challenges. Saladin's strategy remained one of patience and careful preparation. He sought to maintain his control over the key cities and fortresses in the region while avoiding a direct confrontation that could potentially tip the balance in favor of the Crusaders. As June progressed, the weather in the Levant grew hotter, adding to the difficulties faced by the Crusader army. The heat, combined with the ongoing logistical challenges of maintaining a large force in the field, began to take its toll on the Crusaders. Disease and exhaustion became increasingly common, and Richard had to work hard to keep his troops motivated and focused on the tasks at hand. In mid-June, Richard received word that reinforcements from Europe were en route to the Holy Land. These reinforcements, though welcome, presented both an opportunity and a challenge. On the one hand, they could bolster the Crusader army and provide the additional manpower needed for a renewed push toward Jerusalem. On the other hand, the arrival of new troops also meant that Richard would need to manage even more complex dynamics within the Crusader ranks, as the newcomers would bring their own leaders, agendas, and expectations. Despite these challenges, Richard continued to pursue a dual strategy of fortification and negotiation. He strengthened his hold on Ascalon and the surrounding territories while keeping the lines of communication with Saladin open. The two leaders, both aware of the high stakes involved, exchanged envoys and explored potential terms for a truce or settlement. However, the negotiations were delicate and fraught with complications, as both sides sought to secure the best possible outcome without appearing to compromise too much. By the end of June, the situation remained unresolved. The Crusaders had made significant gains, but the ultimate prize of Jerusalem remained elusive. Richard faced increasing pressure from both his own troops and the broader Christian world to achieve a decisive victory. Yet he was also keenly aware of the risks involved in launching a full-scale assault on Jerusalem without adequate preparation or unity among the Crusader ranks. As July 1192 began, Richard continued to explore all options available to him. The campaign had reached a critical juncture, and the decisions made in the coming weeks would determine the future of the Third Crusade. Richard's leadership had brought the Crusaders to the brink of success, but the final outcome was still uncertain. The Crusade's fate hung in the balance, and the eyes of Christendom were once again focused on the Holy Land as Richard and Saladin prepared for the next phase of their epic struggle. As July 1192 progressed, the Crusaders remained in a state of anticipation and uncertainty. The campaign had seen successes, such as the capture of Ascalon, but the ultimate goal, Jerusalem, remained just out of reach. Richard the Lionheart, mindful of the risks involved in a direct assault on the city, continued to balance the delicate dynamics within the Crusader camp while exploring both military and diplomatic avenues. During the early part of July, Richard faced increasing pressure from various factions within the Crusader army. Many of the soldiers and knights were growing restless, eager for decisive action after months of campaigning. The French contingent, in particular, was frustrated by the apparent lack of progress toward Jerusalem. The growing impatience within the camp threatened to undermine Richard's authority and the unity of the crusading forces. Richard responded to these pressures with a combination of diplomacy and pragmatism. He convened councils with the leaders of the various factions, seeking to address their concerns while emphasizing the need for careful planning and preparation. Richard knew that any attempt to assault Jerusalem would require absolute unity and commitment from all the Crusader forces, and he worked tirelessly to maintain cohesion and focus within the camp. At the same time, Richard continued to explore the possibility of negotiating a settlement with Saladin. The two leaders had exchanged envoys throughout the summer, and both recognized the potential benefits of a truce. Saladin, though still committed to defending Jerusalem, was also aware of the toll that the prolonged conflict was taking on his forces and the broader Muslim world. A negotiated settlement could provide a way to secure the holy sites and bring a measure of stability to the region. However, the negotiations were complicated by the differing goals and priorities of the two sides. Richard sought to secure Christian access to Jerusalem and the holy sites, while Saladin was determined to maintain Muslim control over the city. The discussions were further complicated by the need to satisfy the various factions within both the Crusader and Muslim camps. Despite these challenges, the talks continued throughout July, with both Richard and Saladin keeping the lines of communication open. As July turned into August, the situation grew more tense. The Crusaders, still encamped near Ascalon, were increasingly restless. The summer heat, combined with the ongoing logistical challenges of maintaining a large army in the field, began to take a toll on the troops. Disease and exhaustion were becoming more common, and Richard faced the difficult task of keeping his forces motivated and focused. In early August, Richard decided to take a more aggressive stance. He ordered a series of raids on Saladin's positions around Jerusalem, targeting supply lines and smaller fortifications. These raids were designed to disrupt Saladin's ability to sustain his defense of the city and to put additional pressure on him in the ongoing negotiations. The raids were successful, causing significant disruption and forcing Saladin to divert some of his forces to protect key supply routes. Despite these successes, Richard remained cautious about launching a full-scale assault on Jerusalem. He understood that the city's defenses were formidable and that any attack would require careful planning and significant resources. Richard continued to weigh the risks and benefits of an assault, or that a failure to capture the city could be catastrophic for the Crusade. Throughout August, the negotiations with Saladin continued, but progress was slow. Both sides were wary of making major concessions, and the talks often stalled as each leader sought to secure the best possible terms. However, the fact that the negotiations were ongoing reflected the mutual respect between Richard and Saladin and their shared recognition of the difficulties involved in continuing the conflict indefinitely. As August drew to a close, Richard faced a critical decision. The Crusade had reached a point where a decisive action was needed, but the risks of an all-out assault on Jerusalem remained high. Richard's leadership had brought the Crusaders close to their goal, but he knew that the final outcome of the campaign depended on making the right choices in the coming weeks. By the end of August 1192, the Crusaders were poised on the brink of a potential breakthrough. The situation was fluid, with both military and diplomatic options still on the table. Richard's strategic acumen and ability to navigate the complex dynamics of the Crusade would be tested to the fullest as he sought to achieve the ultimate objective of reclaiming Jerusalem or securing a favorable settlement. The months of July and August 1192 had been marked by careful maneuvering, both on the battlefield and at the negotiating table. Richard the Lionheart's leadership remained crucial as the Crusaders prepared for the final phase of the Third Crusade. The outcome was still uncertain, but the events of the next few months would determine the fate of the Holy Land and the legacy of the Crusade. The Third Crusade, led by some of the most iconic figures of the medieval period, was a campaign marked by both triumph and tribulation. Although the Crusaders did not achieve their ultimate goal of recapturing Jerusalem, the Crusade left an enduring legacy that shaped the future of the Holy Land and the relationship between Christian and Muslim worlds. The capture of key cities like Acre and Ascalon and the negotiation of the Treaty of Jaffa secured Christian access to the holy sites and ensured that the Crusader states would endure for several more decades. Throughout the Crusade, the leadership of Richard the Lionheart stood out as a beacon of chivalry and military skill. His ability to secure important victories and navigate complex negotiations with Saladin demonstrated the power of diplomacy as well as the might of arms. The mutual respect between Richard and Saladin, despite the conflict, set a tone for future interactions between these two great civilizations. The Crusade also highlighted the limits of military conquest in the face of determined opposition and complex geopolitical realities. It reinforced the importance of strategic thinking, logistical planning, and the need for unity in the face of adversity. The lessons learned during the Third Crusade would resonate through subsequent campaigns and continue to influence the course of history in the region. As we reflect on the events of the Third Crusade, we see a story of resilience, ambition, and the enduring human desire to achieve what seems impossible. The legacy of this crusade lives on, not only in the annals of history but also in the cultural memory of both the East and the West. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the Third Crusade. I hope you found it as fascinating as I have. There's much more history to explore, and I look forward to bringing you more stories from the past in future episodes. Stay tuned, and until next time, take care.